Hello, welcome back to the Buchla Easel tutorial series. Today we're dealing with the Modulation Oscillator, which is the second sound source in the Buchla Easel, and it does a lot of different things. We've got quite a lot to talk about today. The first thing that we need to discuss is that I reluctantly have to talk a little bit more about how we get sound to the outside world. I'm trying to deal with it component by component, but sometimes we've got no choice other than to just bring a few more bits and pieces in. Everything that we've dealt with up until now with the complex oscillator has been on gate 1, output 1. I'm going to turn that off for the moment, and we're going to switch over to channel B instead. Channel B is connected to gate number 2 in this module that I'm stoically refusing to talk about. Modulation oscillator is hardwired to gate 2 in exactly the same way that the complex oscillator is hardwired to gate 1. So now if I turn level 2 up with channel B at a non-zero volume, we hear a different sound. What you're hearing now is the modulation oscillator. At the moment you're hearing a square wave, but you could be hearing a triangle, or you could be hearing a sawtooth. Turn this volume off, that's annoying. That's the first thing that we need to understand about the modulation oscillator. It's an oscillator in just the same way that the complex oscillator is. It's capable of generating audio tone, and we have 3 different wave shapes to choose from. They're not the same as the 3 wave shapes in the timbre control over here. They do have different characteristics, these oscillators. Now the basic keyboard oriented functionality of the 2 oscillators is the same. So if I take an envelope output and plug it into gate 2 instead, we're now hearing the modulation oscillator being triggered by the envelope in exactly the same way that we did for oscillator 1. Let's get back to our static wave. One thing that I'll mention really quickly, because I regretted not talking about it in the last video, is the purpose of the fine-tune knob. If you're in quantize mode and you're stepping up in semitone offsets, it's the fine-tune knob that gives you the ability to reach the values in between those 2 offsets. I didn't mention that when we were talking about the complex oscillator and just thought I'd throw it in. Okay, so we've got an oscillator capable of generating three different waves, and by default it's hardwired to gate B. Great stuff. Well, we can vary its frequency just in the same way that we can with the complex oscillator. It's a little bit weird. See, on the modulation oscillator the slider is called frequency, and over here it's called pitch, but fundamentally got the same functionality. Take it out of quantize mode, smooth curve. So why have these 2 sliders been called different things? Well, because with the complex oscillator, it's always and only pitch that is controlled with this slider. The modulation oscillator is also capable of acting as a low frequency oscillator. If we click this high-low switch here to low, now the frequency range of the oscillator is from almost nothing up to 50 odd hertz. Well, it depends on what key you're pressing on the keyboard and other various factors. But if I turn the level up, you're just getting that kind of pulsing click thing going on. And eventually it's going to become audible as a very low bass sound. There I've zoomed out as far as I possibly can. Now the LFO, whilst it's kind of cool to make sounds as low as that, that's not really its purpose. In LFO mode, it's designed to be used as a modulator somewhere else. And this is where things can potentially get a little bit tricky to track, because we're back into the territory of having to understand internal wiring. there are hardwired connections between these two oscillators. You see this switch up here at the moment, it's toggled to, I think it stands for balance external. I'm not going to talk about the external mode for reasons we'll come into much later on. It's a little bit complicated. But basically that's just the oscillator acting as an oscillator. If I flick the switch to AM oscillator, it's now hardwired into the complex oscillator. It's basically going to act as an AM modulator on the complex oscillator. It's a bit of a tricky sentence, so let's just kind of slow down and try and figure some stuff out. Let's start off with a really simple default position of our good old oscillator, the complex oscillator, generating a nice simple basic tone. Now I'm going to start increasing the modulation slider of the modulation oscillator. Hear what happens. We're in a square wave configuration here. You see, on, off, on, off. The modulation oscillator, the square wave of the modulation oscillator, is modulating the complex oscillator's volume, the amplitude. Turn it up a little bit. So we just zoomed in on the oscilloscope there so we can see it a little bit more clearly. Now we're increasing the amount of modulation on the amplitude. Now I'll increase the speed at which those modulations occur. Okay, so there's amplitude modulation at LFO rate. Bring the modulation slider back down and the effect disappears. So why are we hearing all that? What's going on there? Well, it's because the modulation oscillator, as I say, is hardwired behind the scenes into the complex oscillator in two different configurations. We've just seen the first one of them. And so by increasing the modulation slider when we're in one of these two modes, we have an implicit effect on the complex oscillator. We modulate its amplitude. If I switch to FM oscillator and we bring the complex oscillator back in, now we're going to modulate the pitch of the complex oscillator. Let's do that. Slow it down a bit. Let's switch the shape of the modulation oscillator. Let's turn it into a triangle instead. It'll make those frequency changes smooth. Slow it down even more and increase the depth of the modulation. Make that pitch change bigger. You can see the tuner is getting more excited now. So these two settings here, AM OSC and FM OSC, are hardwired, pre-configured selection options that connect these two these two oscillators together. The third switch disconnects those internal connections. So when you're in the upper mode, let's call it balanced mode, there's no internal modulation being applied to the complex oscillator. And so now if I bring complex oscillator back in, it doesn't matter what I do with any of these sliders, you're not going to hear it. Okay, so that was all on channel A. That's complex oscillators channel. But as we can see, the modulation oscillator can kind of get in on the act, say, can I join in and do a little bit of modulation to the complex oscillator. Turn channel A back off. Channel B is there all the time. It took me by surprise momentarily then until I realised I was in low frequency mode. That oscillator is actually outputting signal. It's just that we can't hear it because it's so low. If I flick to high mode, there's the tone. I bring this tone back in and also bring channel A back into the equation. You're now hearing both of those effects at the same time. Hearing complex oscillator in channel A, modulation oscillator in channel B, and you can see that they're slightly out of step. Their frequencies are slightly out of step, and that's why you get this kind of strobing effect on the oscilloscope. I have actually tried in one of my more bored moments to sync them up perfectly. It's about 1.5 micro steps out. So somewhere between 501 and 502 gets you as close as you can to those two waves being perfectly synchronized, but you can't actually hard sync them. Let's put oscillator A back to sleep again, the complex oscillator, and just refocus our attention on the modulation oscillator all on its own. So we're back to having a nice simple tone. This can be modulated in exactly the same way the complex oscillator could. So let's throw an envelope into pitch. So we did all this kind of stuff with the complex oscillator. But as things stand, if I plug something into this modulation input, we're actually going to have no effect on anything. We're not going to hear anything. If the modulation oscillator isn't hardwired to the complex oscillator's amplitude or frequency modulation inputs, this modulation slider seems to have nothing to do. It's not having any effect on the sound. On either oscillator, I can bring the original oscillator back in and these sliders are still dead. But that's not the end of the story. If I turn both oscillators on, I put them both in audible frequency range. Pretty unpleasant. But the point I want to demonstrate is that these sliders are both dead. Well, that one is definitely because it's not plugged into anything, but this one is not doing anything. But if I take a jack out of this socket up here that says mod CV out, the modulation oscillator's control voltage out, if I take something from there and plug it into the complex oscillator's timbre modulation, now I've got modulation capability over anything I want. It's basically, let's just set it into low frequency mode there. This modulation output is directly accessible from your mod CV out socket. So this is in addition to the hardwired connections here. So as things stand at the moment, this complex oscillator is operating at basically a consistent volume or amplitude. If I switch to AM oscillator mode, now in addition to having the timbral effect, I'm also modulating the amplitude. It's doing two separate jobs, one of them from the hardwired connection and one of them from the explicit socketed connection over here. Now just a quick word about AM and FM modulation. Most of the examples that I've shown you today have been in low frequency mode. So if I get the complex oscillator up and running again, and we switch instead to having a look at Insight, I'll take that modulation away. We've got a nice simple wave, there we go. So this is currently oscillating at 260 Hertz, it's a C. What I want to find out is what's the frequency of the tone currently being generated by the modulation oscillator. Well, let's set it to something fairly sensible. What's that? 200, let's bring it down a bit. I want to make it lower than that. Perfect, okay. So modulation oscillator B is now cycling at 100 Hertz. And oscillator, complex oscillator A at 260 Hertz. When we apply AM modulation to those two waves, in other words, add them together, we're going to get what's called a sum and difference effect. And the best way to demonstrate that is to bring the modulation, so I've turned it into AM oscillator mode now, so the modulation oscillator is hardwired into the complex oscillator. Now I'm going to increase the modulation and have a look what happens around the 200 to 400 Hertz range. These two side towers are called side bands. They're the sum and difference of the two difference of those two combined waves. So we have 260 plus 100. So this is going to be 360 over here. There we go, brilliant. And we had 260 minus 100. This is going to be 160 over there. That's the fundamental concept behind amplitude modulation. As we increase the modulation, the sidebars just get bigger. And that's tonal colouring. The only difference between AM modulation and FM modulation is that you get the same effect. You're going to get those two towers again, but you also get an infinite series of additional harmonics. So you get the base frequency plus 2n plus 3n plus 4n, so you get 360, 460, 560, and they get smaller and smaller as they tail away. So it's a slightly different algorithm, but both really easy to understand and see. So that's our introduction to the modulation oscillator finished. It was a bit of a heavy one today, I'm sorry about that. Hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful. If you did, please consider subscribing, hit notifications. You'll be sure not to miss the next episode in the series. Hope to see you then. Thanks a lot for watching.